Hey guys, it's me, Dr. Ree, and I just wanted to go through some of the parts of the take-home assignment that is due next Friday. So, this assignment is based on material for your lecture exam. We did a decent amount of the information here for the nervous system in class. General senses and special senses was focused on in lecture. Endocrine system we did in lab. Cardiovascular system is what we're doing this week in lab, and respiratory system is what we did last week in lab. So in nervous system, this you're just drawing, right, the neuron just like we did in lab. These answers, again, use your text to help you kind of find the answers there. A lot of this we did in lab as well. This is that spinal cord drawing that we did in lab. Brachial plexus, again, I have a video before that's the video before this one where we drew out the brachial plexus. For the lumbosacral plexus, if you drew it, that's fine. You can also just do that outline that we did. So using kind of those acronyms for the lumbosacral plexus. So, and then the rest is stuff lecture-wise. Endocrine system, again, you can use a lot of the main stuff that we talked about during lab to kind of fill these out. And we're going to get into cardiovascular in a second. But before I get into cardiovascular, if we go down to the respiratory, we did not in lab go through the types of epithelium. And I'm not sure in lecture if he is either. So you do not have to write down the types of epithelium. But make sure that you do know type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes that are found in alveoli. Again, we didn't do this in lab, but that's a lecture concept. As for the other ones, this is all kind of what we did in lab. So, coming up to cardiovascular, that's what we're doing this week in lab. So a lot of this is very similar to what we will be doing in lab. When we look at blood, we're going to kind of start down here. When we look at blood can be divided into two main groups. We have our plasma and we have our formed elements. So I'll kind of have my plasma in like a yellow color. Plasma makes about 55% of blood is plasma. So I'm just going to estimate that that's about 55%. Now the plasma, if you were to take blood and then centrifuge it, the plasma would go to the top and formed elements would go to the bottom. So that's why I put that on top. So that's the plasma, and we'll do red for the formed elements. So plasma, 55%. Formed elements, 45%. Now the formed elements can be broken down. So now we're doing the percentage of the formed elements. So 99%, that's a big percent, right? 99% of the formed elements are erythrocytes. Erythrocytes are red blood cells. And then the last 1% is made up of two different things. It's made up of leukocytes and platelets. Platelets help with blood clotting, and then leukocytes are our white blood cells. There's a bunch of different types of white blood cells. So we're going to look at those types of white blood cells. So these leukocytes that we see here, we're going to talk about them in this first part. So let's look up here. These are our 5 different types of leukocytes that we see. The most abundant out of our leukocytes is the neutrophil. So neutrophils make up 60 to 80% of our leukocytes that we have. So leukocytes are only less than 1% of our full formed elements. So it's not a lot in comparison to the other things. But out of those less than 1% of leukocytes, neutrophils are going to be. So that one would be the most abundant. From there, we have our lymphocytes. So that would be our next most abundant. Then we'd have our monocytes, our eosinophils, and our basophils. And so that's kind of the order that that we would go. Basophils are the least prolific, with less than 1% of leukocytes being basophils. And we'll talk more about that in lab. Circulation. So let's first go to the heart and then we'll come back to this. So here we have the heart. There's a few different regions that we have in here. Let's first talk about the chambers. There's 4 chambers to the heart. Up here, this top part, that is the right atrium. The right atrium receives blood from the body. So it's receiving blood from the body, which comes in via the superior and inferior vena cavas. So this would be the superior up here, and there's one on the bottom right here, which would be the inferior. Oh, can't spell. Cava. So that's what we see here. So blood starts there. I'm going to take away that. I'm going to change all these to black lettering so that when I do my arrows, style, black. Okay. So that's what we're seeing here. Blood comes in from there. The blood that's coming in is blood that is no longer oxygenated, right? Its oxygen has been replaced. It's gone through the system and it's been replaced. So as the blood comes in, so the blue is representing deoxygenated blood. This has carbon dioxide in it instead. So that's going in. It's then going to go down and through a valve called the right AV valve, the atrial ventricular valve. That's what AV stands for. But we can also call the tricuspid valve. So this is the right AV valve, or also known as the tricuspid valve. The blood's going to go through there into our right ventricle. Which is this space right here. This is our right ventricle right in here. So this is our right atrium, our right ventricle. Our heart's going to contract, and when it contracts, it's going to send that blood up this way through our pulmonary valve, our pulmonary semilunar valve. So it goes in and out through our pulmonary arteries. So our pulmonary arteries have deoxygenated blood. That's something people get confused with because in our body, systemic, our arteries have oxygenated blood and our veins have deoxygenated. But in the pulmonary circuit, the pulmonary arteries have deoxygenated, and then our pulmonary veins are going to have oxygenated. So it's going to go out to the lungs. Then in the lungs, it's going to go to the alveoli. There's going to be gas exchange at the respiratory membrane. And then the blood's going to come back oxygenated through these pulmonary veins into the left atrium. So here's the left atrium. Whoops. Where's my little line? That blood is going to go through the left AV valve, also known as the mitral valve, into the right ventricle. So this is, the left AV, also known as the mitral valve. It's going to go into our left ventricle. The left ventricle is really, really muscly because it has to pump this blood through the entire system, not just the pulmonary circuit. It's going to go, and you can kind of see it here, but it's right behind the pulmonary valve. We have the aortic valve, the aortic semilunar valve. And that is going to open up into the aorta. This part of the aorta we call the arch of the aorta, and then it's going to go out to the rest of the body. You can, in lab, you'll fill in kind of the rest of these, but that's kind of the general idea here. So if we continue with the arrow, come in and go out this way, and then out to the body. So now if we were to draw that in a like a boxed method, here's my box method of this. So a flow chart of the circulation of blood, of a blood cell in the human body. Okay, so I'm going to start from the body. So we have our body. This is a flow chart. This is not like a diagram. So from the body, and the last place it's going to be before it gets to the body is going to be the left ventricle. Or let's put the aorta. So we're going to go from the body to the aorta. So the body, it's going to be deoxygenated, going through those veins. So we're just going to write veins. The veins are going to go to the vena cavas, both the inferior for the lower part of the body and the superior for the upper part of the body, specifically the right upper side. So I'm just going to write VC for vena cava. That's going to go into the right atrium. That's going to go to the right ventricle via the tricuspid valve. That's going to go through the pulmonary valve. So pulmonary valve, pulmonary arteries. That's going to go to the lungs, specifically the alveoli. It's going to get all oxygenated there. Then it's going to go back into the pulmonary veins. That's going to go to the left atrium. From the left atrium, it's going to go to the left ventricle via the mitral valve. I'm going to take away that V for the pulmonary. There we go. From there, from the left ventricle is going to go to the aorta, which is going to go to the body. And it's going to go through the aortic valve, which is known as a semilunar valve. And right here, this would be through the pulmonary valve. So if I were to color code this just for oxygenated, deoxygenated, we're going to say deoxygenated, 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 deoxygenated. Changes there, half and half. And then we're oxygenated, 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 oxygenated into the arteries of the body. I guess I could write arteries here. That kind of bring it back. You can make a flow chart however you like, but that's kind of the flow chart of circulation of a red blood cell. So the last part that we'll be going through lab, and I'm going to do a little drawing of it right now, and then that'll be the end of the video, is drawing out the main arteries and veins of the systemic cardiovascular system or vascular system. So we'll start here. I will make my pen red for arteries. Arteries, besides our pulmonary arteries, are going to be oxygenated. So arteries leave the heart. That's kind of what happens. So here we have our aorta. That's our aortic arch here. And coming off of our aortic arch, we're going to have 3 different extensions. So when we look at our first, as we look at our first extension as we're coming out, we have our brachiocephalic trunk. So that's right here. Brachiocephalic trunk. I'm not going to label them on here. I'm going to be saying them, and then, but all of them are listed here. So, but I'm first going to just draw. Okay, so we have our brachiocephalic trunk. Our brachiocephalic trunk is going to divide into two. We have our right common carotid artery, and then the other one is going to break up into our subclavian artery, our right subclavian artery. Okay, so those are our two. The right subclavian artery, we're just going to follow that for a second. Right subclavian artery is going to be called that until it reaches the axillary region or the armpit region. And it's going to be called the axillary artery. And then from there, it's going to turn into the brachium of the arm and become the brachial artery. It's going to be called the brachial artery until it reaches around the elbow, and it's going to break off into the radial and ulnar artery. The radial being on the radial side of the arm and the ulnar artery being on the ulnar side of the arm. And then it's going to create this little palmar arch at the bottom with some digital arteries that come off of that. If we go back up here to the common carotid, that is going to break into an internal and external carotid artery, and that's the extent that you need to know for this class. On the other side, so that was the first. The next coming off of that, we are going to have the left common carotid. So see how it doesn't have a brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk is only on the right. So we have our left common carotid, and again, that's going to break into an internal and external carotid artery. And then we have our left subclavian. The left subclavian is going to, just like before, it's going to become the axillary here, the brachial artery once it's in the brachium, and then it's going to divide into the radial and ulnar, and there's going to be the palmar arch. I don't know why I merged them. Radial, ulnar, palmar arch with some digital arteries. So that's what we're seeing arterial supply here. So that's all of the stuff from our aortic arch. Then we're going to have our descending aorta. So it's going to come down, and it kind of comes down like this. So I'm going to make it big, just so we know that this is that descending aorta. We have a thoracic descending aorta. That's going to be around here. And then once it passes the diaphragm, it's going to become the abdominal aorta. So I'm just going to make it kind of bigger. Here we have that abdominal aorta. That abdominal aorta is going to break off once it reaches around the hip area, around our ilium, if you remember that from our pelvis, into our common iliac arteries, which is what I drew here. So this is the left, and this is the right common iliac arteries. So there are a few things that kind of break off in our descending aorta. This is the order that they go in. So we have coming off of the top here, a thing called our celiac trunk. You'll talk more about the celiac trunk in lecture. From there, we have our renal arteries. Those are going to be going to our kidneys. So if I drew like a little kidney here, that's where it's going. Going to our kidney. So that's our renal. Below our renal artery is going to be our superior mesenteric artery. Below that is our gonadal artery. And below that is our inferior mesenteric. So it goes superior, gonadal, inferior. So our mesenteric sandwich the gonadal artery. So those are the main ones within the descending aorta that you need to know. So let's go into the lower extremity. So the common iliac is going to separate into an internal and external iliac. So here's my internal, and there's my external. The external is going to continue down into the thigh as the femoral artery. And then that femoral artery is going to go behind the knee into the popliteal artery. So when it's behind the knee, it's called the popliteal artery. and then it's going to kind of break up from there. So we're going to have a few different arteries that we see. We're going to have one that goes here, one that goes on the outside, and one that's right in the middle. And they kind of, some are going to be anterior, posterior, but in this image, I can't really show anterior, posterior. So the three that we see here, and then they kind of go like this. The three that we see here is on the most medial side, we have our posterior tibial. Then we have our anterior tibial. And then we have our fibular, right? Fibular is going to be our most lateral because that's where the fibula is. So those are the three that we see here. Remember, popliteal here, femoral here. Coming off of the femoral, we do have the deep femoral artery. So just a little tiny deep femoral artery there. And this would be our plantar arch. And so you can draw that on both sides or just draw it on one side. So those are our major arteries with labels. So then you can label all those. I talked through them. Let's look at our veins. I need a blue color. Okay. Let's talk about our veins. So our veins are going from the body and up, but I'm going to just start from the hand and go to the heart, and then I'll start from the leg and go to the heart, and we'll kind of fill in between. So, starting in the hand, we have our digital veins, just like we had our digital arteries. They're going to go to two different arches. We'll talk about them a little bit more in depth, but we're just going to call them our palmar arches for now, a superficial and deep one. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, just like how we had up here, we have our right subclavian, right axillary, or not axillary, but our subclavian. And then that is going to break into our brachial. So our brachial is going to be the main kind of vein that comes off of that subclavian. Coming also off of that subclavian is going to be the cephalic vein. And that cephalic vein is going to travel all the way down. So that's going to be a full, it doesn't break off into anything else. Okay, so cephalic is on the lateral aspect of the arm. So the brachial is going to have an extension that comes out of it called the basilic vein. So the basilic's right there. And connecting, it goes out and then it comes back in around the elbow. And that's where we find our medial cubital. So basilic is here. And then where it comes back together right here, that would be the median cubital. Right here would be the median cubital where they come back together. And then from there, it's going to come down to make that arch. And we have two sides, right? We have our radial and our ulnar. Sorry, I didn't branch them out. I started to. So we have our cephalic, our radial, and our ulnar. Oh man, I keep erasing it. Okay. So it's cephalic, radial, ulnar. Basilic, brachial, cephalic. So that's what we're kind of looking at in the arm. So those are all going to end up draining into our right subclavian. That right subclavian is going to drain into our inferior vena cava. So here's my inferior vena cava, or my superior vena cava, sorry. Right, we're coming from the upper arm. So that's going to all flow into the superior vena cava that we see here. Also flowing into this, we have our jugular veins. Our internal and external jugular veins are going to be coming into that right subclavian and into that superior vena cava. So that's the right side of the body. Left side of the body is going to be very, very similar. We're going to have this kind of come here. We're going to have those, and then that whole arm thing. I'm just not going to draw all of that again, but that's what we're seeing on that side. Then we have our inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava, we don't call it like the descending aorta like we did. This whole area, this is all the inferior vena cava. So inferior vena cava is running that whole aspect. And then we have that break into our common iliac veins. So very similar to the arteries. Just like we had with our descending aorta, we have a few different veins that are at different points. Here are the ones you need to know. So our top one is our hepatic. Hepatic is going to the liver. Anything that says hepatic is liver. So we have our hepatic is our first one on our transit from superior to inferior, even though it's going the opposite. Then we have our renal. Again, renal goes to our kidneys. So our renal vein. Below that, we have our gonadal. And below that, we have our lumbar. Those are all the veins that we see there. There's some other smaller ones, but those are the ones you need to know for the class. So we have our common iliac. I'll draw on this side what happens, but it happens on both sides. So just like we had before, we have an internal and external iliac. So this will be our external, and that will be our internal. The internal stops at internal life. Our external is then going to be divided into two extensions. So we have our femoral vein, and then going down the medial aspect of the leg, we have our great saphenous vein. So that's our great saphenous. And this is our femoral. The femoral does have a little break off of the deep femoral. So I'll put that right there as the deep femoral. Now this is where it gets there's a lot more vein work happening in the leg area. So we're gonna take a second and kind of go. So the great saphenous is on the medial aspect. The small saphenous is going to be the opposite. It's going to be on the lateral aspect. So the most lateral aspect, that's going to be the small saphenous. I'm going to write SS, small saphenous. We're going to have also breaking off. Here's my popliteal. Also breaking the popliteal is going to break off into those three other like we had before. So we have 1, 2, 3. So now we have 5 veins in our leg versus the 3 that we saw in the other one. But going from lateral, that would be our fibular vein. We then have our anterior tibial vein and our posterior tibial vein. And right, this is our great saphenous. They're all going to come together into that arch, into our dorsal venous arches, and our plantar arch. The plantar arch is going to be on the bottom of the foot. The dorsal venous arch is going to be on the top of the foot. So those are all our veins. We'll be going through more of this in lab, but this is just to help supplement that. All right, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to email me or come to my office hours. And if not, I'll see you in lab.